What if every limit you believe defines you is not imposed by the world, not written by fate, not enforced by circumstance, but silently constructed by your own mind, accepted without trial, defended without evidence, and obeyed without question? Sit with that question, because the answer will not comfort you. It will strip you. It will remove the final place where excuses hide. Napoleon Hill understood something most people never dare to face, that success is not denied to us by external forces first, but by internal agreements we make with fear, doubt, and inherited beliefs. Long before a man fails in business, in wealth, in influence, or in life, he fails in thought. Failure is not an event. It is a conclusion reached by a mind that has been conditioned to expect limitation. And the tragedy is not that limitation exists, but that it is so rarely challenged. From the moment you became aware of yourself, ideas were planted in your mind. Some were useful, many were poisonous. You were told what was realistic, what was possible, what was appropriate for someone like you. These ideas did not arrive as enemies. They arrived as advice, as protection, as concern. But over time, they hardened into law. You stopped questioning them, you stopped testing them, and eventually you stopped seeing them at all. This is the most dangerous form of imprisonment, the kind where the prisoner defends the bars. Napoleon Hill did not teach success as a matter of luck, intelligence, or circumstance. He taught it as a psychological conquest, a war waged internally long before the world ever responds. He observed that every great achievement begins as a thought held with such intensity that it reorganizes the mind around it. Not a wish, not a hope, a burning desire so disciplined, so emotionally charged, so persistent, that the mind begins to reject all ideas that contradict it. This is not inspiration, this is mental domination. Most people live with scattered desires. They want many things weakly. Hill saw that nature responds only to definiteness. A vague desire produces vague results. A divided mind produces inconsistent action. And inconsistent action reinforces doubt. This is the cycle of limitation. The individual believes they lack confidence when in truth they lack commitment to a single, clearly defined purpose. The mind cannot gather power when it is constantly changing direction. Definiteness of purpose is not merely knowing what you want, it is knowing it so clearly that competing thoughts are starved of attention. It is choosing a destination so firmly that indecision becomes intolerable. When Hill spoke of definiteness, he spoke of mental alignment. Every thought, every emotion, every habit brought into obedience to a central aim. This level of focus feels extreme to the undisciplined mind. It feels obsessive. But obsession is merely intensity without control. Purpose is intensity under command. Limiting beliefs survive in ambiguity. They thrive in the absence of clarity. When you do not know exactly what you are aiming for, fear fills the space. Doubt negotiates, excuses sound reasonable. But when purpose becomes definite, something ruthless awakens. The mind begins to ask only one question. Does this thought serve the aim, or does it weaken it? And in that question, limitation is exposed. Burning desire is the fuel that sustains this focus. Hill was precise in his language. He did not say desire alone. He said burning desire, a desire that consumes indifference, a desire that produces emotional heat, a desire that refuses to coexist with resignation. Most people mistake desire for preference. They want success the way they want comfort, approval, or entertainment. Hill spoke of desire that reorganizes identity, the kind of desire that makes retreat psychologically painful. Limiting beliefs dissolve under sustained emotional intensity. Fear survives when emotion is low. Doubt thrives in apathy. But when desire becomes emotionally charged, when it is reinforced daily through thought and imagination, the mind begins to reinterpret reality. Obstacles are no longer evidence of impossibility. They become signals of proximity. Resistance becomes confirmation that something meaningful is at stake. Faith, as Hill described it, is not religious sentiment, it is mental expectancy. It is the capacity of the mind to assume the reality of a future state so fully that it begins to act as if that state already exists. This is where most people misunderstand and dismiss the principle. They confuse faith with blind belief. Hill described it as conditioned belief, Faith is built through repetition, autosuggestion, and emotional reinforcement. It is trained. Your mind accepts as truth whatever you repeatedly tell it with emotion. This is not philosophy. It is psychological fact. The subconscious does not evaluate truth. It records impressions. It does not reason. It responds. When you repeatedly declare limitation, you install it. When you repeatedly rehearse failure scenarios, you program avoidance. And when you repeatedly affirm weakness, the mind obeys by producing behavior that confirms it. Autosuggestion is the method by which belief is installed. It is the bridge between conscious intention and subconscious programming. Hill understood that the mind is shaped not by occasional thoughts, but by dominant thoughts. What you dwell upon, emotionally and repeatedly, becomes your internal reality, and your internal reality dictates your external results. Most people allow their inner dialogue to be governed by habit and environment. They speak to themselves in the language of fear they inherited. They rehearse doubts they did not originate. They relive defeats they could reinterpret. Autosuggestion, when used deliberately, reverses this process. It is not positive thinking. It is mental discipline. It is choosing what ideas are permitted to repeat. But autosuggestion only works when it is emotionally charged and aligned with action. Empty words spoken without conviction produce no effect. Hill insisted that desire, faith, and autosuggestion must operate together. Desire supplies the emotion. Faith supplies expectancy. Autosuggestion supplies repetition. Remove one and the structure collapses. Persistence is the behavioral expression of belief. It is proof, not to the world, but to the mind. Every time you persist despite discomfort, rejection, or delay, you reinforce the identity of someone who does not retreat. And identity is the deepest layer of belief. Limiting beliefs are not merely thoughts, they are conclusions about who you are. Persistence challenges those conclusions through experience. Most people stop not because they are defeated, but because they become uncomfortable. Hill observed that the majority quit when progress slows, when enthusiasm fades, or when results do not arrive on schedule. At that moment, the mind begins to negotiate. It questions the goal. It questions the method. It questions the self. Persistence silences that negotiation by refusing to enter.
Retain withdrawal as an option.
Self-discipline is the structure that makes persistence sustainable. Without discipline, desire burns out. With discipline, desire becomes a controlled force. Hill taught that the disciplined mind does not rely on mood. It operates by decision. It does not wait for confidence. It acts in its absence. Discipline is not restriction, it is direction. It channels energy instead of wasting it. Fear is the great architect of limitation. Not fear of physical harm, but fear of loss, rejection, poverty, criticism, and failure. Hill identified fear as a state of mind that can be controlled, not eliminated, but mastered. Fear is information interpreted through insecurity. It magnifies uncertainty and diminishes capability. When fear is unexamined, it becomes authority. When examined, it becomes manageable. The mastery of fear begins with understanding that it is self-generated. Circumstances do not produce fear. Interpretation does. Two individuals can face the same situation and experience entirely different emotional responses. This proves that fear is not in the event, but in the meaning assigned to it. And meaning is chosen, whether consciously or not. Imagination is the workshop of the mind. It is where plans are formed, rehearsed, and emotionally experienced before they manifest. Hill regarded imagination as the most powerful faculty available to humans, not fantasy, but directed imagination, the ability to mentally construct outcomes, strategies, and identities before they appear physically. Limiting beliefs restrict imagination. They narrow what you allow yourself to envision. When imagination is disciplined and fueled by desire, it becomes a force that reorganizes perception. You begin to notice opportunities previously invisible. You interpret feedback differently. You respond instead of react. The world has not changed, but your relationship to it has. This is how inner change precedes external change. Decision is the point where thought becomes action. Hill noted that successful people make decisions quickly and change them slowly, while unsuccessful people do the opposite. Indecision is fertile ground for limiting beliefs. It allows doubt to masquerade as caution. It delays commitment while appearing responsible. But every delayed decision is a decision to remain as you are. The invisible mental forces Hill described are not mystical in the way people assume. They are psychological laws operating beneath awareness. Dominant thoughts influence behavior. Behavior shapes habit. Habit solidifies character. Character determines destiny. This chain is invisible to those who live unconsciously, but mercilessly consistent. There are no exceptions, only awareness or ignorance. Success, then, is not something you pursue externally first. It is something you permit internally. It begins when you withdraw consent from limiting beliefs, when you stop identifying with inherited fears, when you accept total responsibility for the contents of your mind. This is not comforting work. It is demanding. It requires honesty without mercy. Napoleon Hill did not promise ease. He promised possibility to those willing to master themselves. The removal of limiting beliefs is not a single moment. It is a daily act of discipline, a repeated choice to challenge thoughts that weaken you and reinforce those that strengthen you. The mind resists change because identity is at stake. But identity can be reauthored. As you continue listening, understand this: nothing you will hear is meant to inspire you temporarily. It is meant to confront you permanently. You are not here to feel good. You are here to become dangerous to your old limitations. And that process begins not with the world changing, but with you refusing to remain mentally obedient to beliefs that no longer serve your purpose. This is only the beginning. The moment you accept that limitation is learned rather than destined, the mind enters a dangerous territory. Dangerous because responsibility can no longer be outsourced. Dangerous because excuses lose their authority. Dangerous because the comfortable narrative that failure is caused by forces outside your control collapses. Napoleon Hill understood that this moment is where most people retreat, not because the truth is unclear, but because it is unbearable to the undisciplined ego. To accept that your beliefs shape your outcomes is to accept that every unfulfilled potential has a source closer than circumstance. It is to face the quiet, relentless power of choice. Most individuals never consciously choose their beliefs. They absorb them, they inherit them, from parents who meant well but feared deeply, from teachers who measured intelligence narrowly, from culture that rewards conformity and punishes deviation. These beliefs settle into the subconscious long before critical thinking matures. By adulthood, they feel natural, they feel like reality. Hill saw this as the root of stagnation. People defend their limitations because those limitations have become familiar, and familiarity, even when painful, feels safer than the unknown. The subconscious mind does not differentiate between truth and repetition. It does not analyze evidence. It accepts what is impressed upon it with emotional intensity. This is why early experiences leave such deep marks. This is why a single humiliating failure can echo for decades. And this is why deliberate reprogramming is not optional for anyone seeking uncommon results. You cannot reason your way out of a belief that was installed emotionally. You must replace it with a stronger emotional pattern. Hill's insistence on autosuggestion was not mystical optimism. It was strategic conditioning. He understood that if the mind has been trained into limitation, it can be trained out of it. But the process is uncomfortable because it requires confronting internal contradictions. When you begin to assert a new belief, the old one resists. Doubt surfaces. Inner voices argue. This resistance is not evidence of failure. It is evidence that the belief is being challenged. Most people stop here. They mistake resistance for impossibility. They interpret discomfort as danger. Hill taught that this moment is decisive. Persistence through internal resistance is the price of belief change. Every repetition of a new idea in the face of internal opposition weakens the old structure. Over time, the new belief does not merely replace the old, it redefines identity. Faith in Hill's framework is not blind acceptance, it is cultivated certainty. It grows through repeated mental rehearsal of success until the mind begins to expect it. Expectation alters perception. You begin to notice alignment where you once saw chaos. You interpret delays as timing rather than rejection. This shift is subtle but profound. The outer world does not suddenly become cooperative. You become psychologically unshakable. Limiting beliefs collapse when they are deprived of emotional reinforcement. Fear survives on attention. Doubt survives on rehearsal. When you redirect emotional energy toward a defined purpose, the old patterns weaken. This is why Hill emphasized definiteness so relentlessly. A mind without a clear aim becomes a battleground for every external influence. A mind with a clear aim filters experience ruthlessly. The average person lives reactively. They respond to events, moods, and opinions. Their mental state fluctuates with circumstances. Hill observed that successful individuals operate from internal command. They decide. How they will think before the world gives them a reason. This is not denial of reality. It is selection of meaning. Two people can experience the same setback. One internalizes it as evidence of inadequacy, the other as data for adjustment. The difference is belief. Self-discipline is the enforcement arm of belief. Without it, belief remains theoretical. Discipline governs what you think when no one is watching. It governs whether you rehearse fear or rehearse vision. It governs whether you indulge impulses that weaken focus or reinforce habits that strengthen it. Hill viewed self-discipline as self-respect in action. You do not discipline what you do not value. Limiting beliefs often disguise themselves as humility. People say they are being realistic. Hill called this intellectual surrender. Realism, when used to justify inaction, becomes a sophisticated form of fear. True realism acknowledges obstacles without surrendering to them. It recognizes constraints while seeking leverage. The disciplined mind does not deny difficulty. It refuses to let difficulty define outcome. Persistence is the testing ground where belief proves itself. Anyone can feel confident when conditions are favorable. Hill measured belief by behavior under pressure, when progress stalls, when effort goes unnoticed, when results lag behind expectation. This is where the majority abandon their aim, not because it is unattainable, but because they are unwilling to endure uncertainty. Persistence is not stubbornness. It is loyalty to purpose in the absence of immediate reward. Fear mastery is central here. Hill identified 6 primary fears that paralyze human action: poverty, criticism, ill health, loss of love, old age, and death. These fears manifest as hesitation, procrastination, and self-sabotage. They do not disappear through reassurance. They dissolve through exposure and reinterpretatio. When you repeatedly act despite fear, the mind recalibrates. Fear loses authority when it no longer controls behavior. Imagination becomes a weapon against limitation when it is directed. Hill distinguished between passive dreaming and active visualization. Passive dreaming escapes reality. Active visualization prepares for it. When you repeatedly visualize yourself acting with confidence, executing plans, overcoming obstacles, the mind begins to accept these scenarios as familiar. Familiarity reduces resistance. Action becomes easier not because the task has changed, but because the mind has rehearsed it. Decision crystallizes all these forces. Indecision drains energy. It leaves the mind open to doubt. Hill observed that powerful individuals decide quickly because they trust their capacity to adapt. Weak individuals delay because they seek certainty before action. Certainty is never available in advance. It emerges through movement. Every decisive action, even when imperfect, strengthens self-trust. The invisible forces Hill described are not external entities manipulating fate. They are internal dynamics shaping perception, motivation, and behavior. Thought precedes action. Emotion fuels thought. Habit sustains action. Over time, these elements converge into what appears to be destiny. But destiny is not imposed, it is accumulated. To remove limiting beliefs, you must become vigilant about your inner environment. What thoughts are repeated? What emotions are indulged? What narratives are rehearsed? This vigilance is exhausting at first because it demands awareness where habit once ruled. But awareness is power. The moment you notice a limiting belief, it loses some of its grip. It moves from unquestioned truth to optional interpretation. Hill insisted on total responsibility not as moral judgment, but as strategic necessity. As long as blame exists, power I displaced. When responsibility is accepted, control returns. This is not about guilt. It is about agency. You cannot change what you do not own. As this process deepens, something shifts. The mind begins to feel quieter, less reactive, more deliberate. Confidence emerges not as bravado, but as stability. You stop needing constant validation. You stop fearing disagreement. Your sense of self becomes anchored in purpose rather than approval. This is the psychological foundation Hill believed was required before external success could be sustained. Without it, achievement collapses under pressure. With it, even failure becomes temporary. Limiting beliefs do not disappear overnight. They erode under sustained discipline. And in that erosion, a different identity begins to take shape. An identity no longer defined by what you were told you could not do, but by what you have decided you will do, regardless of resistance. And this understanding leads deeper still into the mechanisms by which the mind either enslaves itself or liberates itself completely. When the mind begins to loosen its grip on old limitations, a strange tension appears. You feel suspended between identities. The old self no longer fits, but the new self is not yet solidified. This is the most unstable phase of inner transformation, and it is where most people unconsciously sabotage themselves. Napoleon Hill understood this psychological threshold. He knew that when belief systems shift, the mind searches desperately for certainty. If it cannot find certainty and purpose, it retreats to habit. And habit, no matter how painful, feels safe because it is known. This is why Hill placed such relentless emphasis on mental control. Not suppression, not denial, but command. The disciplined mind does not eliminate emotion, it directs it. It does not wait for confidence, it generates it through action. It is not seek permission from circumstance, it issues instruction to itself. Limiting beliefs survive only where the mind is passive. Once the mind becomes active, deliberate, and self-governing, those beliefs begin to starve. Most people assume their thoughts are spontaneous. Hill observed that this belief alone enslaves them. Thoughts are not random events, they are habits of attention. You think what you have trained yourself to think, and what you think repeatedly becomes the lens through which all experience is filtered. This is why two people can live in the same environment and experience entirely different realities. One sees opportunity, the other sees threat. One sees challenge, the other sees confirmation of inadequacy. The environment is neutral. Interpretation is decisive. The subconscious mind is the engine beneath this process. It operates continuously, absorbing impressions, reinforcing patterns, and guiding behavior without consultation. It does not argue, it executes. Hill compared it to fertile soil. It grows whatever is planted, regardless of whether the seed is useful or destructive. Limiting beliefs are not merely thoughts. They are seeds that have been watered for years. To remove them, you must starve them of reinforcement and deliberately plant alternatives. This is where emotional discipline becomes critical. Emotion is the carrier wave of belief. A thought without emotion is weak. A thought charged with emotion imprints deeply. Fear is effective because it is emotionally intense, but so is desire, so is faith. The mind does not distinguish between positive and negative emotion. It responds to intensity and repetition. Hill's genius was in recognizing that the same mechanism that produces fear can be harnessed to produce confidence, courage, and persistence. Burning desire is not enthusiasm. Enthusiasm fluctuates. Burning desire endures. It is anchored in identity rather than mood. When a desire becomes part of how you see yourself, abandoning it feels like self-betrayal. This is why Hill insisted that desire must be backed by a clear plan and a definite purpose. Desire without direction dissipates. Direction without desire becomes mechanical. Together they create psychological momentum. Momentum is a rarely discussed but critical factor in success. Once the mind begins to experience itself as moving forward, even slowly resistance weakens. Action generates feedback. Feedback generates adjustment. Adjustment reinforces competence. Competence strengthens belief. This loop, once established, becomes self-sustaining. Limiting beliefs disrupt momentum by encouraging hesitation. They whisper that preparation is not complete, that conditions are not ideal, that more certainty is required. Hill saw this as a trap. Certainty follows action, it does not precede it. Decision is the rupture point. When you decide, truly decide, the mind reorganizes around that choice. Energy that was scattered consolidates. Attention sharpens. Doubt does not vanish, but it loses authority. Hill observed that successful people are not free from doubt. They are free from indecision. They move forward despite uncertainty, because movement itself produces clarity. Imagination plays a decisive role here. The mind cannot distinguish vividly imagined experience from real experience. When you repeatedly imagine yourself acting decisively, persisting through difficulty, and achieving outcomes aligned with your purpose, the subconscious begins to accept these scenarios as familiar. Familiarity reduces fear. What once felt threatening begins to feel expected. This is not self-deception. It is neurological conditioning. Limiting beliefs often present themselves as warnings. They say, be careful, do not risk too much, do not stand out, do fail publicly. Hill recognized that these warnings are remnants of survival conditioning. They were useful when physical danger was constant. In modern life, they become psychological chains. Growth requires exposure to uncertainty. Without exposure, fear never recalibrates. The mind continues to overestimate risk and underestimate capability. Persistence is the antidote to this distortion. Each time you persist despite discomfort, you provide the mind with contradictory evidence. You survive, you adapt, you learn. Over time, the mind updates its predictions. Fear diminishes not because you argue with it, but because you outgrow it. Hill emphasized that persistence is not dramatic. It is quiet, repetitive, and often invisible. But it is relentless, and relentlessness reshapes identity. Self-discipline ensures that persistence is not dependent on emotion. Discipline is the decision to act according to purpose rather than impulse. It governs sleep, study, focus, and the use of mental energy. Hill viewed undisciplined emotion as one of the greatest drains on human potential. When emotions fluctuate wildly, focus fragments. When focus fragments, effort scatters. Discipline gathers effort into a single direction. The fear of criticism deserves special attention. Hill believed it was one of the most paralyzing forces in human psychology. The need for approval keeps people average. It encourages conformity. It punishes originality internally long before society ever does. To remove this fear, one must accept a hard truth. No significant achievement is possible without misunderstanding, opposition, or ridicule. The disciplined mind anticipates criticism and proceeds anyway. It values results over applause. As belief strengthens, something subtle occurs. Your internal dialogue changes. The tone shifts from negotiation to instruction. Instead of asking, "Can I do this, T?" the mind asks, "How will I do this?" This shift marks the decline of limiting belief. Questions determine focus. When questions change, attention changes. When attention changes, behavior follows. Hill insisted that success is not a matter of chance. It is the predictable outcome of mental alignment. Thought, emotion, decision, and action brought into harmony with a definite purpose. When these elements are aligned, effort compounds. When they are misaligned, effort cancels itself out. The invisible forces governing this process are impersonal. They do not reward intention alone, they respond to consistency. A single act of courage does not rewire a lifetime of fear, but repeated acts do. A single affirmation does not erase years of doubt, but daily reinforcement does. The mind is patient. It will wait as long as it takes for you to prove what you believe through behavior. This is why Hill's philosophy feels demanding. It offers no shortcuts. It offers no sympathy for self-pity. It offers power only in exchange for responsibility. To remove limiting beliefs, you must become ruthless with your own thinking, not harsh but precise. You must notice when fear disguises itself as logic, when laziness disguises itself as caution, when insecurity disguises itself as humility. As this awareness deepens, you begin to experience a new kind of freedom. Not freedom from effort, but freedom from inner sabotage. Energy once consumed by doubt becomes available for creation. Focus once scattered by fear becomes steady. You begin to trust yourself not because you feel invincible, but because you have observed your own persistence. This trust is quiet. It does not announce itself. It expresses itself through consistency, through showing up when motivation is absent, through continuing when progress is invisible, through deciding again and again that your purpose is non-negotiable. And it is here, in this quiet consistency, that the deepest limiting belief begins to dissolve, the belief that you are at the mercy of forces beyond your control. As the mind experiences itself as deliberate, disciplined, and persistent, it can no longer sustain that narrative. Responsibility becomes not a burden, but a source of strength. Yet even this is not the end of the internal struggle. Because as limitation weakens, ambition intensifies, and intensified ambition demands an even higher level of mental control. The next phase is not about removing belief, but about sustaining power without corruption, focus without rigidity, and desire without exhaustion. This is where the philosophy of Napoleon Hill moves from transformation to mastery. As ambition intensifies, the mind encounters a new danger, one that is less obvious than fear, but equally destructive if left unchecked. It is the danger of inner fragmentation. When desire grows stronger, it amplifies everything beneath it. Discipline becomes more necessary, but so does balance of the inner faculties. Napoleon Hill understood that power without control does not lead to freedom, it leads to collapse. Many people overcome limitation only to be undone by excess emotion, ego, or impatience. The removal of limiting beliefs is not the end of psychological work, it is the beginning of a higher standard of self-governance. At this stage, the mind is no longer fighting disbelief, it is fighting distraction. As confidence grows, so do opportunities, ideas, and impulses. Without a disciplined center, these become liabilities. Hill warned that scattered ambition is as dangerous as fear-based inaction. Both drain force, both prevent mastery. The successful individual is not the one with the most ideas, but the one who remains loyal to a single dominating purpose long enough for it to mature. The human mind craves novel. Thank you, it seeks stimulation. This trait, when undisciplined, pulls attention away from depth toward variety. Hill recognized this as one of the reasons people abandon promising paths prematurely. Progress often becomes boring before it becomes rewarding. The disciplined mind anticipates this phase. It does not confuse boredom with stagnation. It understands that repetition is the forge of strength. Limiting beliefs often return in subtle forms during this phase. They no longer say, "You cannot do this." They say, "Perhaps there is a faster way. Perhaps you should change direction. Perhaps this is not enough." These thoughts appear reasonable. They appeal to impatience and ego, but they fracture momentum. Hill emphasized that consistency, not brilliance, produces lasting success. A mind that constantly seeks novelty rarely finishes anything meaningful. Self-discipline at this level becomes less about forcing action and more about protecting focus. It governs what you allow into your mental environment, what you read, what you listen to, who you engage with. Hill understood that environment shapes belief indirectly. The people you surround yourself with reinforce certain assumptions about what is normal, possible, and acceptable. If you immerse yourself in mediocrity, discipline must work twice as hard. If you immerse yourself in purpose-driven minds, discipline is reinforced. This is why Hill emphasized the concept of harmony between mind and environment. Not withdrawal from society, but intentional association. The mind absorbs tone, attitude, and expectation through proximity. Limiting beliefs are contagious. So is ambition. The disciplined individual chooses exposure deliberately, not accidentally. Faith, at this stage, matures into quiet certainty. It no longer needs constant reinforcement. It is no longer loud. It expresses itself through calm persistence. When set, facts occur. They do not provoke panic. They provoke analysis. Emotion is still present, but it is regulated. Hill viewed emotional control as one of the highest forms of intelligence, the ability to feel deeply without being governed by feeling. Fear mastery evolves here as well. Early fear is loud and obvious. Later fear is subtle. It appears as overconfidence, rigidity, or refusal to adapt. Hill warned that fear can invert itself. The fear of failure becomes the fear of change. The mind clings to strategies that once worked but are no longer effective. True mastery requires flexibility without loss of purpose. Imagination must also evolve. In the early stages, imagination is used to build belief. In later stages, it is used to refine strategy. Visualization becomes less about proving possibility and more about anticipating complexity. The disciplined imagination considers obstacles calmly. It prepares responses. It rehearses resilience. This is not pessimism, it is preparedness. Decision-making becomes more nuanced as well. Hill observed that decisive individuals are not reckless, they are responsive. They commit fully, but they remain alert. They do not confuse persistence with stubbornness. Persistence serves purpose. Stubbornness serves ego. Knowing the difference requires humility and self-awareness. Limiting beliefs at this level often attach themselves to identity. You begin to see yourself as a certain kind of person, successful, disciplined, capable. These identities are useful, but they can harden. Hill warned against allowing identity to become a prison. Growth requires continual reassessment. The mind must remain open without becoming indecisive, strong without becoming brittle. The invisible forces governing success respond to adaptability as much as persistence. Nature itself operates this way. Rivers persist, but they adapt. They do not stop when.
Encountering resistance, they reshape their path.
The disciplined mind learns from this. It maintains direction while adjusting method. This balance is rare. It separates those who achieve once from those who achieve repeatedly. Self-discipline now extends to rest, reflection, and renewal. Hill did not glorify exhaustion. He understood that a depleted mind becomes reactive. Fatigue lowers standards. It invites old habits back in. Discipline includes knowing when to pause without quitting, when to reflect without doubting, when to rest without surrendering momentum. At this stage, the internal dialogue becomes increasingly strategic. Emotion no longer dominates conversation. Questions become precise. What is the most effective use of my energy today? What action aligns most closely with my purpose? What adjustment is required now? This level of thinking is not automatic. It is trained through years of intentional practice. The fear of criticism diminishes further, replaced by discernment. Not all feedback is equal. The disciplined mind listens without internalizing. It extracts information without absorbing judgment. Hill believed that emotional independence was essential for sustained success. When approval no longer governs action, clarity increases. Limiting beliefs lose their emotional charge here. They may still appear as thoughts, but they no longer command behavior. They are recognized, assessed, and dismissed. This is the mark of mastery, not the absence of doubt, but the absence of obedience to doubt. As inner control strengthens, something profound occurs. You begin to experience yourself as the author of your responses. Life still delivers uncertainty, loss, and challenge, but the sense of helplessness fades. You no longer ask, why is this happening to me? You ask, what is this requiring of me? This shift is subtle, but it transforms experience. Hill believed that this internal sovereignty was the true reward of success philosophy. External achievement was secondary. Wealth, recognition, and power were byproducts. The real victory was mental independence, the ability to think deliberately under pressure, to choose purpose over impulse, to remain stable in chaos. Yet even here, the work is not finished, because sustained power introduces a final challenge, complacency, the belief that the battle is over, that discipline can relax. Hill warned that the moment vigilance fades, decline begins. Limiting beliefs are patient. They wait for fatigue, distraction, or arrogance. The disciplined mind never declares victory over itself. It maintains respect for its own vulnerability. It continues to practice, to refine, to question, not from insecurity, but from commitment to growth. Purpose is not a destination, it is a direction, and as this realization settles, the philosophy of Napoleon Hill moves toward its final demand. Not improvement, not success, but total ownership. Ownership of thought, ownership of emotion, ownership of decision, ownership of destiny. The next stage is not about becoming more capable. It is about becoming fully accountable, and that demand changes everything. There comes a point in the inner conquest where responsibility stops feeling like a burden and begins to feel like inevitability, not because the world demands it, but because the mind will no longer tolerate evasion. Napoleon Hill understood this stage with ruthless clarity. He observed that long before a person fails externally, they retreat internally, and that retreat always begins with the quiet relaxation of self-command. The moment discipline becomes optional, decline has already been scheduled. At this level of development, the mind is no longer wrestling with obvious doubt. Fear no longer announces itself loudly. Limiting beliefs no longer shout that success is impossible. Instead, they whisper that effort can be softened, that vigilance can be reduced, that comfort has been earned. This is the most dangerous illusion of all, because it does not feel like weakness. It feels like balance. It feels like maturity. But in truth, it is decay disguised as wisdom. Hill warned that every individual who achieves momentum faces a new psychological enemy, complacency dressed as entitlement, the belief that past effort justifies present relaxation, that discipline can be borrowed against, that identity can survive without daily reinforcement. But identity, like muscle, atrophies without use, and belief, once neglected, begins to erode silently. At this stage, excuses evolve. They no longer sound irrational, they sound responsible, they sound humane, they sound deserved. The mind says you have done enough, you have proven yourself, you can afford to slow down. And this is where Hill drew a sharp line between temporary rest and permanent retreat. Rest restores discipline, retreat replaces it. The disciplined mind knows the difference instinctively. The undisciplined mind blurs the boundary intentionally. Absolute accountability is not a personality trait. It is a mental posture. It is the refusal to assign causation outside the self for any internal state. When progress slows, the accountable mind does not blame timing, resources, or conditions. It interrogates its own consistency. When motivation fades, it does not wait for inspiration. It tightens structure. Hill believed that the greatest power available to a human being is the ability to command oneself when emotion refuses to cooperate. Limiting beliefs at this level are sophisticated. They are no longer rooted in fear of failure, but fear of loss, fear of losing status, fear of losing control, fear of destabilizing what has already been built. This fear encourages maintenance over growth. It urges protection rather than expansion. Hill observed that many people peak psychologically at this point. They choose preservation over evolution. And from that moment on, they are no longer moving forward. They are merely holding ground, slowly losing it. The disciplined mind recognizes a brutal truth. Stagnation is regression moving slowly enough to be mistaken for stability. Life does not stand still. The world does not pause. Competition does not rest. Circumstances shift relentlessly. To stop growing is to fall behind invisibly. Hill taught that growth is not optional. It is a law, and laws do not negotiate. Desire must now be governed with greater precision than ever before. Early desire is raw and explosive. It burns away doubt and fuels momentum. But later desire, if left undisciplined, becomes erratic. It chases too many outcomes. It demands gratification. It fractures focus. Hill insisted that desire must mature into devotion to purpose rather than hunger for reward. When reward becomes the primary motivator, discipline weakens. When purpose dominates, discipline stabilizes. At this stage, self-discipline extends beyond action into restraint. Knowing what not to pursue becomes as important as knowing what to pursue. Opportunities multiply. Invitations increase. Distractions become more attractive. The disciplined mind learns to say no without guilt. It understands that every yes consumes energy, and energy, once diluted, loses force. The internal dialogue becomes sharper here. There is less self-encouragement and more self-instruction. The mind no longer asks, "How do I feel about this?" It asks, "What is required?" Emotion is acknowledged but not consulted for permission. Hill believed that emotional maturity was the capacity to experience feeling without surrendering authority to it. This is not suppression, it is hierarchy. Emotion informs, purpose decides. Limiting beliefs often resurface now as moral hesitation. The mind questions whether it is right to want more, whether ambition is selfish, whether growth creates imbalance. These beliefs are often inherited unconsciously from cultures that romanticize struggle and distrust success. Hill identified this as guilt-based limitation, the belief that one must suffer to deserve progress. To remove it, the mind must redefine morality around contribution rather than deprivation. Growth is not immoral when it is aligned with purpose. Stagnation serves no one. Faith at this level is no longer about believing in success. It is about trusting process, trusting discipline, trusting one's ability to adapt. The need for constant reassurance disappears. The mind no longer seeks signs. It understands that consistency itself is the signal. Hill described this as settled faith, quiet, unshaken, immune to fluctuation. Persistence becomes almost invisible. There is no drama in it, no emotional charge. It is simply how the individual operates. Days are not evaluated by how they feel, but by whether they align with purpose. Progress is measured in adherence, not excitement. This removes volatility. The mind becomes stable because it no longer relies on emotional highs to sustain effort. Fear of criticism transforms again at this level. It becomes fear of influence, fear of responsibility for outcomes beyond oneself. As impact grows, consequences expand. Decisions affect others. Visibility increases. Errors carry weight. Hill observed that many retreat here not because they lack ability, but because they fear the moral weight of leadership. The disciplined mind accepts this weight as part of purpose. Influence is not avoided, it is stewarded. Self-discipline now includes the regulation of pride. Success creates identity reinforcement, praise. Feeds ego. Ego resists correction. Hill warned that unchecked ego invites downfall by blinding perception. The disciplined mind remains teachable. It listens without defensiveness. It adjusts without humiliation. It understands that strength is not the absence of correction, but the ability to receive it without fracture. Imagination shifts once more. It is no longer focused on personal achievement alone, but on longevity, sustainability, legacy. The mind begins to ask not just how can I win, but how can this endure? This perspective tempers impulsiveness. It introduces patience without reducing intensity. Hill believed that those who think beyond immediate gratification build structures that outlast them. Decision-making becomes deeply principled. Shortcuts lose appeal. Compromise feels expensive. The mind understands that every violation of principle weakens internal authority, and once internal authority erodes, discipline collapses from within. Hill insisted that character was not a moral abstraction. It was psychological infrastructure. Without it, success implodes under pressure. Limiting beliefs about identity often surface again here. The mind wonders if this level of discipline is sustainable, if intensity must eventually fade, if this version of the self can be maintained indefinitely. These doubts arise not from weakness, but from fatigue. Hill recognized this and emphasized renewal rather than retreat. Renewal is intentional restoration. Retreat is abandonment. The disciplined mind renews by refining systems, not lowering standards. At this stage, time perception changes, urgency decreases, not because desire has faded, but because patience has matured. The mind understands that mastery unfolds over years, not moments. This patience is not passive, it is active endurance, the ability to sustain pressure without panic, to remain committed without anxiety. Limiting beliefs, when they appear now, are stripped of emotional power. They are observed almost clinically. The mind notes them without identification. This is crucial. Identification gives belief authority. Observation removes it. Hill taught that the moment you stop saying, "I am afraid," and start saying, "Fear is present," control shifts. Language shapes ownership. Ownership shapes power. As alignment deepens, the invisible forces Hill described respond with consistency. Not miracles, not sudden windfalls, but compounding results. Momentum builds quietly. Systems reinforce themselves. To the outside observer, success appears inevitable, but inevitability is not fate. It is discipline repeated without exception. The individual at this stage no longer seeks validation. Approval has no leverage. Criticism has limited reach. The internal standard governs. This standard is not perfection. It is integrity of effort. Did I do what I committed to do? Did I honor my purpose today? These questions replace external comparison entirely. Identity stabilizes here, not as achiever, not as winner, but as disciplined operator, someone who shows up regardless of conditions, someone who executes regardless of mood, someone who adjusts without quitting. This identity is resilient. It does not collapse under failure. It does not inflate under success. It endures. Hill believed this was the psychological position from which true power emerges, power that is not reactive, not defensive, not hungry, but grounded, focused, relentless. And from this position, the final demand becomes unavoidable, because once discipline governs thought, emotion, and behavior, once limitation has been stripped of authority, once purpose has become law rather than preference, there is no room left for hesitation. The final step is not understanding. It is commitment without escape. And that moment, the moment where the mind must choose execution over contemplation, arrives next. There is no further place to retreat now, no remaining illusion to hide behind, no comforting theory left to contemplate. What remains is action stripped of romance, commitment stripped of excuse, and responsibility stripped of negotiation. Napoleon Hill understood that this is the final confrontation every individual must face alone, not with the world, not with circumstance, not with fate, but with the self that still hesitates when it knows exactly what must be done. At this stage, the mind is quiet in a way it has never been before, not because uncertainty has vanished, but because indecision has lost its voice. You are no longer confused about what success requires. You are no longer searching for permission, clarity, or signs. You know. And knowing creates a burden heavier than ignorance ever could. Because once knowledge is present, delay becomes deliberate. And deliberate delay is a decision. Hill never softened this truth. He made it explicit. The universe responds not to wishes, not to intentions, but to applied purpose. Life does not reward potential. It rewards execution, and execution is ruthless. It demands consistency when emotion fades. It demands discipline when comfort tempts. It demands courage when visibility exposes you. At this level, failure is no longer tragic. Only retreat is. Limiting beliefs have nowhere left to hide now. They cannot disguise themselves as fear because fear has been examined. They cannot disguise themselves as caution because experience has replaced speculation. They cannot disguise themselves as humility because humility has been redefined as obedience to purpose rather than obedience to insecurity. What remains, if hesitation still exists, is choice, and choice cannot be blamed. Hill believed that the final enemy is not doubt but divided. Allegiance, the desire to move forward while secretly preserving an escape, to commit while keeping an exit open, to pursue greatness while reserving the right to quit without consequence. This split drains power, it weakens effort, it tells the subconscious that retreat is acceptable, and the subconscious obeys instructions without argument. Total commitment is not intensity, it is finality, it is the removal of alternative identities, the decision that this path is not one option among many, but the path. When this decision is made, behavior changes automatically. Energy consolidates. Focus sharpens. The mind stops arguing with itself. Hill described this as the moment when effort feels lighter, not because the work has become easier, but because resistance has been eliminated. Resistance is internal friction. It is the cost of negotiating with your own purpose. Once negotiation ends, energy is freed. Action becomes direct. Not effortless, but unburdened. This is the psychological state from which sustained greatness emerges. Not brilliance, not luck, alignment. Faith now expresses itself as inevitability, not arrogance, not assumption, but the calm certainty that consistent action will produce results because it always has. This faith is grounded in evidence, in your own behavior, in your own endurance, in your own refusal to retreat. Hill insisted that this kind of faith cannot be taught. It must be earned through persistence. Fear, at this point, is reduced to sensation. It may still arise, but it no longer informs decision. The body may react. The mind does not comply. Courage is no longer dramatic. It is procedural. You act because acting is required, not because fear has vanished. This is mastery. Imagination now functions as command center. You envision outcomes not to motivate yourself, but to guide strategy. Visualization becomes practical, precise. You see obstacles clearly without emotional distortion. You anticipate resistance without intimidation. You prepare contingencies without panic. This clarity is rare. It is the product of disciplined thinking sustained over time. Decision-making becomes swift and grounded. You no longer seek perfect information. You seek sufficient information and decisive movement. Hill observed that at this level, people trust themselves not because they believe they are always right, but because they trust their ability to correct course without collapse. Adaptability replaces perfectionism. Momentum replaces hesitation. Self-discipline becomes identity rather than effort. You do not force yourself to act. Acting is simply what you do. Standards are internalized. There is no internal debate about whether to show up, persist, or continue. Those questions no longer exist. The only question that remains is how effectively you will execute today. Limiting beliefs, if they appear at all now, are echoes, residual habits of thought that no longer align with behavior. They are noticed and dismissed without ceremony. They do not provoke emotional response. They do not slow movement. This is the final proof that they no longer govern you. The invisible forces Hill described respond powerfully here because consistency has reached critical mass. Results compound, patterns stabilize. Cause and effect become predictable. The chaos that once defined your inner world has been replaced by structure. The unpredictability that once defined your external world has been replaced by leverage. At this stage, success no longer feels like achievement. It feels like obligation, an obligation to use your capacity fully, to honor the discipline you have built, to justify the sacrifices you have made. Hill believed that the greatest tragedy was not failure, but unused potential. And unused potential is always a result of withdrawal, never inability. You are no longer allowed the luxury of misunderstanding yourself. You know what you are capable of now. You know what happens when you persist. You know what happens when you retreat. This knowledge removes innocence. You cannot claim confusion. Only choice remains, and this is where Hill's philosophy makes its final demand. Not that you try harder, not that you believe more, not that you wait for confidence, clarity, or comfort, but that you decide. Decide that your purpose is not negotiable. Decide that discipline is not conditional. Decide that emotion will not overrule commitment. Decide that fear will not dictate behavior. Decide that excuses no longer have jurisdiction in your mind. Decide that your life will be shaped by deliberate thought and relentless action, not inherited limitation or momentary comfort. This decision is not made once. It is reaffirmed daily, in silence, in solitude, when no one is watching, when no applause is available, when progress is invisible, when temptation is loud, when fatigue argues persuasively, and you will be tested, not once, but repeatedly, tested by delay, tested by boredom, tested by criticism, tested by isolation, tested by success itself. Each test will ask the same question: will you remain loyal to the person you have decided to become? Napoleon Hill never promised ease. He promised power to those willing to govern themselves without compromise, power that does not depend on circumstance, power that does not collapse under pressure, power rooted in mental calm. And now the responsibility is yours alone. No philosophy can act for you. No understanding can substitute for execution. No inspiration can replace discipline. No future can be claimed without present action. You either accept total responsibility for your thoughts, your decisions, your persistence, and your results, or you surrender that responsibility and live with the consequences. There is no third option. Stand now in that truth. Remove every remaining excuse. Withdraw permission from every limiting belief. Commit without escape. Act without negotiation. persist without deadline, and build your life deliberately, or accept consciously and without illusion the life that undisciplined thought will build for you. The choice is immediate, the responsibility is absolute, and the moment to act is now.